Welcome to our latest edition of Energy Transition Insights. I'm Raegan Bond, a partner with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors, and I'm joined by my colleague Philippe Dunsky to have a discussion about the recent federal election in Canada and what it means for the energy sector. So Philippe, some of our viewers at home may be wondering why on earth we're talking about this when we had an election that some would say ended up exactly where we were before the election, with the ruling party. So you and I talked about this, and we found that we think there really is something to talk about here, and that while the House may look pretty similar to before the election, in fact, things have changed, and there were many announcements made during the campaign, and many previously announced policies reinforced that we think will have major impact on the energy sector and on our clients specifically in Canada. And when you and I spoke, we talked about the concept of there's been many new announcements and reinforcement of both carrots and sticks. So carrots being incentives and investments, and sticks, regulations, legislations, and the like. So why don't we start with the sticks and give us some of your thoughts on what you saw come out of the election?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, there are a number of new sticks here. And let me just start with what I think is the most important or most significant new one, and that is a ZEV mandate, so a mandate for zero emission vehicles. You recall prior to the election, the governing party had a goal, right? A goal of zero emission vehicles. During the election, promises were made to actually adopt legislation to require, and the requirement is twofold. One is 100% of light duty vehicle sales would be either electric or some version of non-emitting by 2035. And then the second piece is an interim target of 50% of sales by 2030. Now that's really big, and that changes the game for a lot of people.
So absolutely, this is a game changer, for sure for drivers and those in the market to purchase a vehicle, but it also impacts utilities and municipalities and other folks. So what do you think it means for clients like utilities?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with utilities. Indeed, utilities, we used to say they have to keep the lights on. Now they have to keep the cars rolling, right? And that's a change. So, on the one hand, this actually makes life a little bit easier for utilities in the sense of, predictability. We now know from a generation standpoint how much additional power we're going to need, pretty much by 2030 and by 2035. That's the easy part. The tougher part is understanding how that additional need is going to get distributed across the territory, right? In which load pockets, which substations are going to have what impact? Because we know that electric vehicles are not adopted uniformly. A lot of sociodemographic factors that really affect that. So, we recently did work for one utility, for example, in Canada, where we took a very fine-tooth comb approach and forecast adoption, at every substation. And one of the interesting things we found, looking at a scenario like the 50%, there's some substations that are going to be absolutely fine. They have plenty of capacity to take on all these additional electric vehicles. There are others that are really going to struggle. And, we found a number of substations in that case where we had to advance significant infrastructure investment by sometimes 5, sometimes 10, sometimes up to 15 years earlier than was initially planned. So, that's a major impact from a planning perspective, from an investment perspective, and it really requires some deep thinking and some very granular forecasting to understand where we need to be putting money over the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can attest firsthand, having worked at an electric utility myself for many years, that we were talking 10 to 15 years out. That's near term, and that they would need to start that planning now. That doesn't happen overnight. So it really has increased the urgency of our need to act. So what about municipalities, though? What do you think their role is in this?
Yeah, well, I mean, talking about a territorial view of things, I mean, municipalities, that's where they are, right? So again, it depends on the municipality. So if you're a municipality that, your territory is mostly made up of is very suburban or rural and people have garages, not much of an issue. If you're more of an urban or a semi-urban municipality and you've got a lot of multifamily buildings, condo buildings, row houses without garages, I mean, there's a real issue there. We're talking about 1 of every 2 vehicles becoming electric And if they can't charge at night, we have a serious issue. So municipalities can get involved in a couple of ways. One is facilitating residential street level chargers, so public chargers, but in residential streets. And that's a permitting issue. It's a regulatory issue. It's an investment issue. And then second is all those multifamily and condo buildings, basically any building that has underground parking, they need to have enough electrical entry power to take on and to power all these new vehicles. So, municipalities can get involved there in terms of building codes, for example, to ensure that there's enough power coming in, there's enough charging infrastructure available for people to charge their cars at night, make sure the charging infrastructure itself is smart charging, et cetera. Again, municipalities they are not the number one player in this, but they have a very important role to facilitate their citizens' participation in it.
Absolutely. And we can see from the number of municipal EV strategies that we've been doing over the past few years right across Canada, I think it's fair to say municipalities increasingly are recognizing the role they have when it comes to electric mobility. And so I think that's a positive sign.
Indeed, and that's only the first of the sticks. There are others. There's the Clean Electricity Standard, for example. Do you want to take that one on?
Sure. This is going to be a very important piece of legislation in Canada. There's no doubt. So the government has announced that by 2035, the intention is for all electricity in Canada to be net zero emissions. So some of the specific details of how this will be rolled out mechanically are not yet known. However, it's clear to us, and it should be clear to everyone, that there has been a very specific and ambitious line drawn in the sand when it comes to electricity in Canada. And for those viewers who may not be aware, though most are in Canada, the way our sector works is that while we are overall a very low carbon electricity sector across Canada as a whole, we know that this varies very much from province to province. So this new clean electricity standard will have disproportionate challenges and impacts depending on the province. So this is certainly an area that we are highly attuned to, and we will be well positioned to advise our clients as the details roll out. The third one I think that we talk about that we do know a lot more details is the carbon tax. So, this is not a new announcement, but I think this election certainly still enforces it. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, the election pretty much cements the carbon tax proposal, right? So, again, a year ago, we didn't even know if this thing was going to happen. The promise of a rising tax to $170 a ton by 2030. Supreme Court has since approved it. So that was a big win for that tax. And now for the first time, it's been given a public mandate through this election. So that seems to be now in the clear. I think everyone should expect, of course, who knows what happens after the next election in who knows how many years. But generally speaking, we can now plan for a carbon tax that's rising to $170. The other aspect of this, of course, is that tax, as much as we always talk about $170 tax, truth is that only applies in provinces where there is not an alternative equivalency agreement with the federal government. So, there are a lot of provinces, Quebec, for example, New Brunswick, for example, that have these alternatives that the federal government has deemed acceptable. One of the things I think is going to happen here as the federal government's mandate has now been clarified is we should expect them to be a lot more stringent in those negotiations. There are some things that were negotiated previously that probably will not be renegotiated in the same way. And provinces are probably going to have to up their games in terms of meeting an equivalency standard.
Yeah, so clearly we can see there's been a number of new compliance and, as we said, sticks that have been announced in this recent election. But as we said off the top, it's not all sticks. There's definitely a continued commitment to incentives and investments or carrots. But we are seeing a couple of interesting things come out of this recent election. And that is, it seems more of a focus on targeting those incentives and those investments in a way that is encouraging an equitable energy transition. So the days of providing incentives to everyone in the market seems to be fading, and the focus appears to be more on providing incentives to those that need it most. And so ensuring that as we transition to clean energy technologies and as we move to a low and zero carbon future, that we don't leave anyone behind. And when we say anyone, that could mean individual households, it can mean provinces, it can mean specific sectors of the economy. So I think we saw a couple things in this recent election announced that support that, and maybe you can walk us through an example.
Yeah, I think one great example of this is the promise of $250 million to support low-income Canadian households to get off of fuel oil, heating oil. That's obviously very significant from an equity standpoint. It also, of course, raises real issues and challenges and opportunities at the same time for electric utilities. Given that most of that load is probably going to go electric, toward heat pumps, for example. So, we're not sure yet. It remains to be determined whether that money is going to flow through federal government, through provincial governments, or through existing utility programs. But certainly, there's real dollars there to help those who have the most difficulty in this transition to actually achieve it.
Yeah, and I think another hallmark example is the Energy Futures Fund, which is $2 billion that has been committed to help some of the provinces, the more carbon-intensive economies currently of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, help them make this transition into the clean energy future. And so I think again, those are two live examples at both the household level and then the provincial level, where there is this commitment to fostering an equitable clean energy transition and using incentives and investment in a more targeted way to do so. And maybe lastly on carrots, these recent new announcements are incremental to many of the investments that have been made over the last few years by the federal government in all sorts of clean energy transition issues, whether it's EV infrastructure or in the housing area, for example, where there's been $900 million invested through FCM programs for housing. And in that case, there's been a focus on not just incremental housing, but sustainable and energy efficient housing. So that is certainly something that's worthwhile to continue.
Absolutely. And all of this ties into the much broader context that we're in right now, which is the pandemic. And quite frankly, the deficits that we are taking on right now, needed as they are, at some point we're going to have to get that under control and start cutting spending. That's not going to be right now, but that's going to come down the road. So as we think about that future where we're going to be cutting public spending and trying to get a handle on public budgets, certainly this move from broad-based incentives to much more targeted strategic incentives really fits with that quite well.
Couldn't agree more.
So, why don't we end it there? Thank you so much. This is always great conversation to have with you. And I guess I'll just invite anyone, if you've got any questions, if you want to comment on this, feel free to reach out to us. You've got our emails in this video, and otherwise reach out to us on LinkedIn or check out our website, dunsky.com. And again, thank you very much.